Okay.
Hello, hello. This is Rabbi Shmuel Pollan. How are you doing? Happy Wednesday to you. We have a very interesting guest that we've had on before, Dr. Lawrence Vacera, and we're going to be talking about an important issue. Um, this has to do with atheism and their attacks on the Bible, on the Old Testament. And I've so often heard them say that there's no evidence that the Jews were ever in Egypt. And I didn't really know how to respond to that. But I now have someone to help me do that. And he is the doctor here. And Dr. Vacera, maybe you can just tell us for a quick minute about your background and your current position right now.
Okay, thank you. Uh, vis-a-vis, I'll just talk about the relevant parts for this sort of study. Initially, I began my academic training in archaeology. I wanted to be an archaeologist. I did a half of a doctorate in archaeology at Arizona State. And then I transferred had an opportunity at Stanford. If I changed my field, I went to Stanford and did an MA in counseling psych and worked in that and came out of that and began working in psych research. Up to that point, I'd been doing research in archaeology. From there, I conducted some federally funded projects on a variety of subjects. I went back to Stanford, got my first doctorate in policy analysis, and I did work in those areas on all kinds of research issues, defense, taxation, variety of things over the years. Then I was complaining to my wife one day about how lousy the histories of the Second World War are. It was just, when perestroika was starting in Russia, at least how lousy they are vis-a-vis the United States and Russia and the way we work together. So my wife said, well, why don't you do something about that? So I wrote some letters to the Claremont College's graduate school, and they gave me a fellowship to go back and do a second doctorate in political economy and world systems theory. At any rate, I did research in those areas, and most of my life spent doing research. But then in retirement, we moved out to a little town in California where the California State Paleontology Lab is. And for the last 12 years, Sue and I have been, my wife, and I have been working in paleontology. So my background is pretty varied, but there has been a focus on archaeology and paleontology kind of all along. I was very fortunate to be in on a group that made a major discovery. It made headlines. It was on the all over the world, actually. Some of you may have heard of it in 2017. It's called the Cerruti Mastodon. We discovered this mastodon in California that could show work of signs of being worked on by humans and so on. At any rate, that's kind of a quick thumbnail. So I've done research in about 7 or 8 different, I've published research in about 7 or 8 different fields.
So do you have an opinion as to when dinosaurs lived?
That's a big subject.
Yeah.
I think the best work that's been done on it has been done by a nuclear physicist named Gerald Schroeder, who was very instrumental in Israel's hydrogen bomb program. He was at MIT, he was a professor at MIT for a long time, and then he was brought to Israel to develop the Israeli hydrogen bomb. And he really showed using Einstein's time dilation equations, I think the most convincing answer to the conundrum of the problem of ages of the universe and the Earth, in that if you apply Einstein's time dilation equations to the problem of the age of the Earth, the problem is solved. from, if you argue that from God's perspective, it's been 6,000 years, 7,000 years. From our perspective, though, from where we are in the universe, it's been 13.5 billion years. That's a whole huge other area.
Right.
And I think Schroeder really is the only one that I've read who has, I think, convincingly solved the problem, because basically he argues that both are absolutely true. The biblical account and the modern scientific account. But that's another whole huge area.
Yeah. Okay, let's not get sidetracked.
Yes. Yeah, we have a big enough area here. This area itself is huge. We're the
I was looking for a one-word answer, but I guess it's not possible.
True, right?
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into what exactly is the controversy surrounding the placement of the Jewish people, the Israelites, in Egypt, around, according to Jewish sources, around 1313 B.C.E. I don't know if you have similar dates in your tradition, but that's around where it was according to our tradition. But what is the controversy exactly?
Okay, of course, the biblical minimalists, people like Israel Finkelstein, the IAA rather, sorry, argue that the Exodus never happened. The whole thing was fictional. That not only that, basically they argue that almost all of Jewish history was physical, that the Bible was written, including the Torah, was written in Babylon around 550 BC, that this was done for political reasons, to give the Jewish people that were there in exile a history to kind of rally around, to help fold them together until they could get back to Israel and reestablish the temple. And this became the dominant view among scholars, starting in the mid-19th century. Actually, that was the emerging view. And this was supported by, there were two main pillars that supported this. Well, of course, and you realize how important this is. If the Exodus was a fictional account, that means that we did not get the Ten Commandments from God.
Right.
And what could be more important? That is the core of Jewish and Christian belief.
Yeah.
That we have, that there is absolute morality, and that absolute morality comes from God, and God gave it. And not only, of course, do we have, but especially in Judaism, not only do we have the Ten Commandments, but you have the rest of the law. So, you take that away, and what's left?
Not much.
Yeah. So the two core problems are that at 1350, the main reason that date of 1350 was set, at least in the scientific community, was because of two passages in the Bible. Now, 1350 puts the Exodus into the New Kingdom period of Egyptian history. Well, the two big arguments were that number one, that the Jews did not yet have alphabetic writing, and you really could not write the Bible without alphabetic writing. And the other was that when you look for Exodus at that time, for the presence of Jews in Egypt at that time, you find no evidence for it. And the reason that date got set is because of two verses of scripture. One, in Exodus 11:1, we're told, so they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. And the other one is in Exodus 12:20, 1237, which reads, the Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Sukkoth, which was the very first step in the Exodus, in that Exodus journey. Well, these two quotes were used to put the Jews in, or the Israelites, I'm sorry, at that time, in Egypt at that time and starting the Exodus at that time. The city of Ramses that was referred to in Exodus, we have very good dating on it. And as you said, it dates from around 1350 BC to about 1250. We know it was built in that period. And there is no evidence for Semites at all in Egypt at that time. When they dug up the Ramses, but the city of Pi-Ramses, which there was a city of Ramses, they found no evidence at all for the presence of Semitic people there at all. So that became those two facts, that it was argued that they didn't have alphabetic writing, so Moses could not have written it. And the other, that there was no archaeological evidence for the Israelites in Egypt at that time, are both absolutely correct. However,
Big however.
yeah, if you were to say, Europeans, I have a theory that Europeans never discovered America. And you ask me, what's my evidence? And I'd say, well, the Europeans discovered America in the year 500. So we go back and I say, we've dug 1,000 archaeological sites throughout all North America in the 500s, and there's no evidence that Europeans were here. Well, that's absolutely true. There's no, maybe a little odd thing turns up every once in a while, but there's no evidence for it. An archaeologist named Manfred Bitak has been the main excavator of Pi-Ramses. But what they found was, when you dig underneath the city of Pi-Ramses, what you find is an older city, which has been named Avarice. And in Avarice, Middle Kingdom, about 1650 BC. If you dig in Avarice, you find enormous evidence of a Semitic population, a very large Semitic population. And, we know this from the archaeological remains. And of course, Avarice, and Pi-Ramses are right up in the land of Goshen, in the, probably the best part of Goshen, up in the upper Nile Delta, almost to the coast. Very lush land at the time. And we find Syro-Palestinian style graves, which, would have been, the Canaanite style that the Israelites brought to Egypt. We find Syro-Palestinian type, early Israelite burials. The way the people are buried is consistent with that. We also find the fact that they were shepherds. We find the remains of, typical remains of a shepherding people. Also, the way the archaeology of Avarice goes, I just have a quick, I'll hold this up. No, it's just translate very well on the camera. You can see it. Oops, did I have it upside down? No.
That look right.
Yeah. On the top level, you have Ramses, the city of Ramses, and underneath it, you have Avarice. Avarice starts out as a very small town, and then grows very quickly. And the people there were very wealthy. The graves we find are the graves of very prosperous people, very well fed. The skeletal material shows they were in good health. But then there's a period after about the first 100 years when we see a big change in the skeletal material, and that They are, these are people now who are being worked very hard. We see changes in the ligature, attachment points on the bones. We see calcium and phosphorus deficiencies in the bones. We see the lifespan drop. We see the grave goods drop. And it goes that way for a period of several hundred years. And then Avarice is abandoned all of a sudden. It's just abandoned. And then Ramses is built on top of it. Well, this comports exactly with the Bible. They're told, okay, the Israelites came into the area. They were treated very well. The first Pharaoh that under Joseph, was very amenable to them, gave them this prime land. They prospered. Their population grew enormously to the point that the Egyptians saw them as a security threat. And then they went into slavery. The Egyptians put them in slavery. Of course, when they went into slavery, you see this in the skeletal material that, they were, their standard of living dropped, their diet dropped, they were being worked very heavy. And then when the Exodus comes, they leave all at once. Avarice doesn't just slowly deteriorate. It's not that it starts from nothing, grows, and then is abandoned. And then Ramses is built on top of it. Now, the answer is, why does the Bible refer to the city of Ramses instead of Avarice?
Yeah, I was gonna ask that just question. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you were writing a history, I was born in New York. And, if you were writing, New York used to be called New Amsterdam. That was the original, name of New York. If you were to say, now, well, Larry was born in New Amsterdam, people wouldn't know, most people wouldn't know what you're talking about. Well, apparently, what is suspected that happened when, the Bible was translated from Hebrew into Babylonian during the time of the Exodus for the Israelites who were living in Babylon, that probably the editors changed the name from Avarice to Ramses so that people would know what they were talking about. Because after they had been there, this had been hundreds of years later, we're talking now almost 1,000 years later. If you had told the Israelites this time it would have been Jews. If you told the Jews in Babylon, well, you built, you were living in the city of Avarice, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. But if you told them you were living, in Ramses, they would know exactly what you're talking about, because Ramses, was a big city, kind of like New York, referring it to New Amsterdam. So, there was that. And actually, before just something, I'm sorry. Did you want to go through the outline, or I hate to jump around.
Looks like we're up to number 4, or further than that.
Oh, the evidence for alphabetic writing. Yeah, we talked about that somewhat before. This is another huge subject, and it's something that I think the scholarship on it is really, really, really important. It was thought that alphabetic writing was developed around 950 BC, and the reason was that we had no evidence of alphabetic writing before that. But as archaeologists, it's really important that we see that the Israelites had alphabetic writing in order to be able to write the Bible. If they didn't have alphabetic writing, it's very difficult to see how Moses, if he lived either of course, now the evidence is that the Exodus occurred in even further back in time than the Middle Kingdom. I'm sorry, than the Old Kingdom. than the New Kingdom, probably was written in the Middle Kingdom. So we're looking at trying to find evidence that if Moses wrote it around 1650 BC, then we need evidence that he had alphabetic writing, had access to alphabetic writing then. The problem with writing the Bible without alphabetic writing is that there would have been two options. One would have been cuneiform, which you do on clay tablets, which means that the Torah, to carry a cuneiform copy of the Torah with you, you'd probably need a pickup truck. It would weigh, 30 tons or something. You'd probably need an 18-wheeler. And if you wrote it in hieroglyphics, in glyptic writing, again, it would have been very long, very cumbersome. You would have needed a huge number of scrolls. And the other important thing is that it would have only been accessible to a very small number of people. Well, because glyptic writing is like Chinese. Chinese, you have 50,000 characters, and Egyptian glyptic writing is the same thing. You have this enormous number of characters, whereas alphabetic writing, you just have a limited number of characters. Like in English, we have 26 characters, and you can write any word, and even a child can learn. That's one of the most important things about the brilliance of alphabetic writing, is that anyone, if you can speak it, you can read it because you can sound it out. With glyptic writing, you can't do that. So glyptic writing is very difficult to learn, and that's why it's a priestly class or a particular class that does the writing and reading. That's why you had scribes, because with glyptic writing, it's very, very difficult to learn. Well, it appears that now there's developing evidence, there's quite a bit of it, that alphabetic writing developed in the Syro-Palestinian area in Israel, in Canaan at that time. And there's a new discovery that was just made recently. This is a picture of it. It's a comb that was discovered at Lachish. And the layer that it came out of at Lachish dates to 1750. And so, this would have been available to Moses, because this would have been about 100 years before Moses, maybe 50 years before Moses was in Egypt. So we know there was already, and it has a sentence on it, which is also important. And the sentence reads, let's see, what does it say? It says, made this tusk root, made this ivory tusk root out the lice of the beard may root out the lice of the hair in the beard. So this is the very first sentence we have written in alphabetic writing, but it's extremely important because it shows that Moses, that the Israelites in Egypt would have, and it's written in Proto-Hebrew. So we know that the Israelites had access to it, and it appears that the alphabetic writing, arguably one of the greatest discoveries and developments of all time, may have actually happened in Canaan. It looks like more and more that it happened in Canaan and was developed by the Proto-Hebrews. This was the group that, of course, Jacob and his family came out of. And, Sue pointed out to, my wife pointed out to me that, and this is, I think that, the work of God, he gave this to the Proto-Hebrews so that they could write the Bible. That's why it was given to them. That's why they developed it. If they had only had access to cuneiform or hieroglyphic writing, we would not have the Bible. Well, again, you could not have written the Bible. Moses could not have written the Bible. And not only that, but the vast majority of Hebrew people could not have learned to read it, because glyptic writing, again, every one of them would have had to go to scribal school to learn how to read it. With alphabetic writing, You can teach a 5-year-old, a 4-year-old. I think you were reading at 3, Shmuel. Uh, you can even teach very young children. You can teach anyone. If you have, just, normal average intelligence, you can learn to probably, most of us learn to read in the first grade, I guess. With Scrabble school, you're in school for like 10 years to learn how to read and write. So at any rate, so this part of the argument about Moses not having access to alphabetic writing now is pretty much moving off the table. It's no longer being argued much because we have growing evidence that no, the Israelites in Egypt would have had access to alphabetic writing. So then the issue becomes, well, what's the evidence that they were in Egypt, that they were ever in Egypt at all? Again, people like Israel Finkelstein, who's the kind of spokesman for the biblical minimalists, was arguing that there was no evidence for Israelites in Egypt at all ever. Well, this is, and if you argue that around 1350 there were no Semites in Egypt, you're absolutely right. But actually, that now, if you assume that the Exodus took place 200 years earlier, actually 300 years earlier, then there's enormous evidence, but you would expect there to be no evidence by the 1200s, 1300s, because they left. The Exodus happened and they were all gone. So it turns out that absence, if anything, is evidence for the Exodus, because Syro-Palestinian people, Canaanites, Proto-Hebrews, early Jews, whatever we want to call them. What's the term that you prefer? I mean, I prefer calling them Israelites.
Israelites would, to us, refer to Jacob's immediate family, to his immediate children, because Israelite comes from the name Israel, which is Jacob. After that, I just like to call them Jews because they're really the same people.
Okay, I agree. That's my preference too. I think, after, Israelite seems to apply for at least through the conquest.
Mhm.
But after that, I think Jewish is, is an apt description. Let's see.
I just wanted to point out that according to our tradition, as far as like kids are concerned, children who are uneducated, mostly what was taught was the oral tradition, which was given to Moses along with the 10 Commandments. And that's what was mostly taught at that time, was, the intricate laws of the Sabbath and, theft and all these laws, that explain what the verses say, which you cannot really understand the verses without the oral tradition. But that is what they sort of delved into at that time, and that would not require an alphabet, for that kind of study. So I think that most people, definitely most people did not actually have a scroll in front of them or alphabetic remains in front of them. They were studying from person to person to person. Do you have any such tradition?
Well, of course, historically, in the big split between in Christianity between Protestants and Catholics is the Catholics have a very rich oral tradition that goes along with the written tradition, just like Judaism. But the Protestants have eliminated that tradition, and that's really one of the big differences.
Okay.
Personally, I think the Jews got it right, even though I'm not a Catholic. But of course, but then the Jews then wrote the oral tradition down too. So you get both. which is,
Eventually,
yeah,
that was much later on.
in this excavation of Avarice, though, there's the best part of it that is just absolutely amazing is that, we in the story of Jacob's sons in Egypt, we have the story, okay, they're living in Israel. Jacob has these dreams and he has conflict with his brothers. His brothers sell him into slavery. He goes down to Egypt. Then he works for Potiphar and he rises through the ranks, and then ends up in jail because of Potiphar's wife. He rises up through the ranks again, interprets these dreams for two of Pharaoh's officials. He meets Pharaoh. Pharaoh's very impressed. Pharaoh then puts him in charge of rescuing Egypt during the time of famine that's coming. Then Joseph brings his family comes down. And then, we have the story of how the Israelites prosper in Egypt. And then they become a security threat, or the Egyptians see them as a security threat. Then we get the story of Moses, his birth. And finally, the conflict with Pharaoh, the plagues, and then the Exodus. Yeah. Well, if you look at the archaeological remains in the 1600, in the Middle Kingdom, you find evidence for all of this. And it's just absolutely amazing.
Really?
Yeah. For an example, in Egypt, when Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of overseeing his rescue plan for the Egyptian population because of the coming famines, one of the things we know in the Middle Kingdom, something that was done, there's a very long canal that was dug in Egypt from below the first cataract all the way up to Lake Fayoum, which had been a dry lake at that point. Lake Fayoum is a big lake just south of the Nile, southwest of the Nile Delta. Now, water is taken out of the Nile and put into that lake as a reserve, as a giant reservoir to, help through the period of drought, because Joseph knew, that a drought was coming and that would destroy the crops. To this day, that canal is named the Canal of Joseph. That's really? Its modern name. That's what it's called. And it's still in use. That canal dug in the Middle Kingdom is still in use. And it's called the Canal of Joseph. Joseph is not an Egyptian name. But it gets better. It gets even beyond that.
We think that's where his coffin was placed, because his coffin was placed, according to our tradition, in a canal, in a river, and then it was brought up through a magic use of a god's name. And is this the canal where you thought that Joseph was placed when he died? Is that what you're saying?
No. I'm not quite sure how that would fit in. Let me show you what we have archaeologically, and maybe it's possible that that maybe those stories mesh together. What we have found archaeologically is in the city of Avarice, at its very lowest level, it starts out as a very small little town. And there is, in the middle of it, there is a really nice Canaanite-style house, Israelite-style house built. It has a very distinctive style, very different than Egyptian houses. But on top of that house, then very shortly after, there is a big palace built. And this is an artist's rendering of the archaeological remains that have been found of that palace. Mm-hmm. And you'll notice there are 12 pillars in front of that house.
Yeah, I see that.
Okay. big palace. Now, we know from, Egyptology that this was the sort of house that a palace that you would build for a senior official. There really was no business class at that time of any size at all. You had priests, you had the rulers, and you had, the working class. So this was a senior political official. Okay, and it's in the Canaanite style, the Israelite style of that time. This house has around it, in addition to being in that style, there are 12 graves. And one of those 12 graves is this pyramidal structure. Let's see, where's my, this pyramidal structure here.
Yeah.
Now,
I see that.
Inside that one pyramidal structure, the others are smaller tombs. Inside that, they find the remains of a statue. Here's these are photographs of the remains of that statue. Now, the statue, there's still paint on the fragments of the statue that they have found. Okay, the statue is very large, indicating that this was an important person.
So who do we think that was?
I'm sorry, what?
So who do we think that was?
Okay, well, I think that many people think that this undoubtedly had to be Joseph, and here's why. First of all, the skin was painted a light yellow. Typically, the way the Egyptians depicted northerners and foreigners, especially from Canaan, was by giving them a light yellow skin. They depicted themselves as kind of a dark brown, but they predicted them, portrayed the northerners with this light yellow skin. So right off, we know this is a northerner. He's wearing his hair in a bun, which is the style that the Syro-Palestinian peoples of that time, which would have included the Israelites, his hair is in a bun. So this is clearly someone of real importance for the Syro-Palestinian area. Also, he has a throwing stick that they have found, in the fragments that are there. There's a throwing stick over his shoulder. I think you can see a little bit of it here. Yeah, you can see a little bit of the throwing stick. I don't know why
So they actually found a skeleton. How did the skin survive? How are you able to tell anything about the skin?
No, that's the paint on the statue.
Oh, on the statue. Oh,
these are fragments. These are fragments of the statue.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay, now, so this is someone of Syro-Palestinian origin, clearly, from the skin color, from the hairstyle, and he's very important. He has a throwing stick. His statue is huge. This statue is probably like 8 feet tall inside the tomb. And here's the other thing. Look at what he's wearing. It's a coat of many colors. And there you can see the fragments of paint that have been found on the remnants of the statue that were inside that tomb. It's Joseph's coat of many colors. They depicted him. What more? I mean, talking about, sometimes I think this is God's way of teasing us with, how can you guys be so blind? This is it. This is Joseph. This was Joseph's tomb. And here's the other thing. The tomb is empty. We know that and here's the other thing we can tell that the tomb was not robbed. When tombs are robbed, you dig up a robbed tomb archaeologically, you find definite evidence. They're done haphazard, things are thrown around and just the valuable stuff is taken. If they were mummified, you'd find wrappings and you'd find bone fragments, typically of a robbed grave. None of that. the body was clearly exhumed. The archaeological evidence is that this body was exhumed. Now, this was in the Nile Delta, and it's possible that the area, which was subject to flooding, and one of the things that would happen in a flood is that bodies tend to pop up to the surface. This happens all the time. Even we had flooding when we had that flooding in New Orleans a few years ago. A dike broke, and they had flooding in New Orleans, and in some of the graveyards, buried bodies did pop up. So possibly, maybe Joseph's body, might have, if it was buried in this tomb, might have, due to flooding, might have come up, and so those two, the two may be completely consistent. But I mean, this is, I think, just absolutely stunningly remarkable archaeological evidence supporting the story of the Exodus.
That's amazing.
It truly is, and it even there's the saying, there are none so blind as those that will not see. Archaeologists, mainline archaeologists, do not want to acknowledge the fact that that is what's been discovered. With political correctness, of course, and atheism, and the battle against God, being conducted by our media, our government, our courts, our schools. You have this huge investiture in it. Another key point, let me just look, see. Going back to the story of Joseph, one of the things, another part of the story of Exodus is that when Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of rescuing Egypt from this famine, one of the things that Joseph did was basically he, at first we're told that first when they started trading that, the food for that had been stored first, they got all the gold, all the currency, which went to Pharaoh. Then they got the land, which went to Pharaoh. Then they got the people, which went to Pharaoh. Well, in the Middle Kingdom, at the beginning of the around 1750 BC, Egypt was governed by, you had a powerful pharaoh, but he wasn't all that powerful. You had what they call nomarches, which were like regional governors around Egypt. There were, I don't know if we know the exact numbers, but I don't know, it was like 12, 15, whatever, these nomarches, which were very powerful local officials, and they were rich. We see in the Middle Kingdom, we see that the power of the nomarches evaporates and the power of the pharaoh really grows. This is, again, the power of the pharaoh since the Old Kingdom had been diminishing, and the power of these regional rulers had been growing. However, at the time of the Exodus, just as recorded in the Bible, assuming that, the Exodus happened in the Middle Kingdom and not in the New Kingdom, there was this big transfer of power from the regional rulers back to the pharaoh, and the pharaoh became a very strong absolute ruler once again. So we have that evidence too. Again, completely consistent with the Bible, exactly what you would expect. Then, of course, another big one are the plagues. And this has been for 100 years up until recently. It was and you'll see this argued even today, that in the Egyptian literature, there's no mention of the plagues. And if there was something as big as the plagues, surely that would have been recorded in writing by the Egyptians. The claim that there's no written record is absolutely false. We have a document called the Ifor Papyrus, which dates from the Middle Kingdom. And this is a picture of the Ipuwer papyrus. It's not a very good picture, but it is in the Leiden Museum in Holland. And it dates to around 1650 BC. Now, on the Leiden papyrus, when you read it, now you can read it, it's not that long. We see a number of very, very, very interesting points. We see that, first of all, the first thing that strikes you is there's total confusion all over Egypt that this scribe Ipuwer is writing about. There's massive confusion, very, very confused. And he talks about, oh, I'm sorry, something I meant to mention, but I forgot, in terms of evidence that the Israelites were in Egypt at the time of Joseph in the Middle Kingdom and that they were enslaved. There's so much evidence. Before we get to the plagues, there's another papyrus called the Brooklyn Papyrus. And it is a list of like a couple of hundred names of slaves. And about 70% of them are undeniably Semitic names. I mean, they're names like Asher and Issachar and Menachem. Those names were already there. And about 70% of them are showing that at this point, there were a lot of Jewish slaves, a lot of Hebrew slaves. We also know that we know that their lifespans became shorter, their standard of living declined, their physical health declined. And we know this from the archaeological excavations of the graves. We also know, interestingly, about the time of Moses' birth. We see in the graves, we see a huge number of males, baby males. And then after that, we see a shift in the male to female ratio, just like this exactly like what you would expect from based on the Bible. Right. When Pharaoh ordered that the young boys be killed, you're going to find a lot of dead boys, and then you're going to find immediately after that, for a period of time, you're going to find more girls than boys. Exactly what you'd expect, and then it stops. They leave, and they're gone. Okay, back to the plagues. The Ipuwer papyrus, in addition to talking about this period of confusion, that there's this general confusion throughout Egypt, it refers to the fact that the river has been turned to blood. Wow. It refers to the fact that the barley and the flax crops have failed. You remember, the hail came in and destroyed the barley and the flax. We know it refers to a period of darkness, and it refers to plagues sweeping through the land. I mean, what could be clearer? This is describing the plagues. But I mean, this thing of those, I saw an interview with the director of the Leiden Museum, where the Ipuwer papyrus is kept, and he was asked, well, doesn't the Ipuwer papyrus show that the plagues of Egypt as recorded in the Bible are accurate? There are evidence supporting that. And he said, no, it doesn't. And asked why. And he said, well, Ipuwer was just imagining this. He didn't see it with his own eyes. He's imagining it. Really? He imagines an account like 300 years before the time that they thought Moses was supposed to be not writing the Torah, because he didn't actually exist. So this scribe what a stupid answer. Oh, I think he was imagining it. Yeah, he was having a nightmare, and that's what he wrote down. But there are others, I've heard others claim that, well, Ipuwer's papyrus was an early attempt at a novel. I mean, give me a break. This was the world's first novel. Ipuwer's papyrus was the world's first novel. what absolute absurdity. There it is right before you. You can go to Leiden and you can look at it, and it's the story of the plagues laid out right there. But again, because it's interesting, people argue, but first of all, that there was no Moses and there was no Exodus. But that Exodus that never happened had to have happened in the New Kingdom. If it never happened, what difference does it make when it didn't happen? I mean, I'm seriously, this kind of logic just drives me nuts. I mean, what are you talking about? It's, reminds me of a TV skit I saw where some woman comes home and she finds her husband in bed with another woman, and the wife starts, yelling and screaming, and the other woman just calmly gets dressed and leaves. And after a while, the husband says to the wife, "What are you screaming about?" Well, that woman that was here. And the husband says, "What woman? There's no woman here. What are you talking about?" And then the wife starts to wonder, he's gaslighting her. The wife starts wondering, what, am I losing my mind?
It's the definition of gaslighting.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of other things too that we know. The Avarice was population when it got to its peak was about 25,000, which is pretty big. But we have over 20 other sites that have been found in Egypt that we think are, when they're excavated, well, one more has been excavated, which is very similar to Avarice in terms of what they're seeing. That site's called Kahun. There's about another 20 sites that we know of already in the Delta, which probably we suspect are going to follow this pattern. So in terms of the numbers that are given in the Bible that left in the Exodus, we have these big numbers of people, hundreds of thousands. This is what you would need. Just the people of Avarice alone would not have been enough to meet the numbers in the Bible. But when you consider that now we probably know about more than 20 other similar sites, the kind of numbers that are written about in the Bible become realistic.
Yeah.
Oh, and just a couple of other things that I forgot to mention. The Ippur Papyrus also mentions that things have been turned on its head, that the poor have become rich and the rich have become poor. What do we know? God told the Israelites to ask the Egyptians for their gold and silver before they left. Exactly what you would expect. The slaves now are rich, and the formerly rich people now don't lost their gold and silver. Exactly. I mean, it's the story. It's all right there. In addition to that, we have another independent evidence. In addition to these other cities that have been found, similar condition, and the Ippur Papyrus, we also, from Manetho, who was the main authority that the Greeks, got their Egyptian chronology for, that we primarily use today, mentions the fact that under a pharaoh called Dudamos, God smote Egypt. And Dudamos was a pharaoh around 1650 BC. And so we have that as a third source, and of course, that was the way both the Egyptians and the Israelites saw it. God smote Egypt, and there was this period of chaos. We have a period of chaos there in the Middle Kingdom when Dudamos would have been pharaoh, where we have about 7 or 8, or maybe as many as 10 periods of transitions of government that all happened really quick. We're not even sure who some of these people were, whether they were pharaohs or generals or they were foreigners, because Egypt was in such turmoil because of the impact of the plagues that, the history becomes, just literally incoherent. But it's totally consistent with what you would expect from the Bible. I mean, what we'd expect when every firstborn dies. You're going to have chaos. Oh, and that's the other thing we find. we find graves of that Middle Kingdom period consistent with this. Instead of being nicely buried, like, the Egyptians were really into burying their dead, with great ceremony and properly. We find graves all over Egypt in that time period where bodies are they're mass burials. The bodies just thrown into graves, and of course, when the firstborn die, you're going to probably lose like 10, 15% of your population like that. How are you going to bury them all? You can't, have all these nice elaborate burials. And
So it was done haphazardly.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, where do you think we are up to in the outline?
Well, I think that's we've pretty well gone through it.
The whole thing?
Yeah, I'm just looking to see if we covered all the did we skip any?
Oh yeah, we covered Dutamos, God in Egypt.
Yeah, yeah, I think we've pretty well covered all the major points. This is a growing field, though. As I showed, I think since we did, like, this discovery was made since we did our last podcast, which was, I don't know what, about 6 weeks ago. So this is a developing field. There's new discoveries all the time. It's getting one thing I did forget to mention in terms of moving the date of the Exodus from the New Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom. We now have two Egyptian inscriptions that have been found that date from about 1250 BC that refer to Israel and talking about Israel. And they both refer to military action against the Israelites. So in order for the Egyptians to have been carrying out military operations against the Israelites, that means this has to be post-Exodus, long enough for the Jews to have gone back to Israel, the conquest to have happened, and for them to be established there as a nation. So this New Kingdom date has to be pushed back to be consistent with the archaeological evidence. But the wonderful thing about it is you push it back 300 years, and the whole claim that there's no evidence for the Exodus absolutely disappears. It's totally consistent with the Bible. And there's not one thing stopping this other than the fact that people don't want to admit it.
Well, online, they just obviously don't know about any of this because there's so many claims repeated on websites like Quora that there was no evidence of the Jewish presence in Egypt. No evidence. And we've just seen overwhelming evidence. And
oh, yeah. And the evidence we've seen isn't just little evidence. It's totally consistent. I mean, the discovery of the Joseph house in the Joseph tomb is, to me, this is just mind-boggling. It's almost like God's sense of humor. Okay, here, you don't think that, how do you account for this?
It's just total ignorance. It's just total ignorance. People are just not aware of this, and I'm really looking forward to promoting this video because it really turns everything upside down, and the Bible wins again.
Absolutely. And to me, this again, it's so reassuring. Once again, we have clear evidence that not only is the spiritual, there's still people like Israel Finkelstein, even though he argues that, well, the Exodus never happened, but still the moral lessons that are written in the Bible, the Ten Commandments, well, God didn't hand those to Moses, but still, they're good. There's a good moral lesson there. There's more than a good moral lesson. there is fact behind this. This happened. And to argue that that what we have to take from this is kind of morality now consistent with our time, because when Moses wrote or when the guy who never existed, called Moses, wrote this. Have you heard that? There's a theory out there that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, but it was another guy by the name of Moses. That's, that's actually out there. Anything you can say anything as long as it's not true.
Yeah, this is unbelievable. This isn't what you call a red pill. This is a red pill. Yeah. Okay, so I have to go now. Okay. But I thank you so much. This was truly, truly fascinating. I hope people pay close attention to this video and tell your friends, because people are totally unaware of this evidence, and it's overwhelming. And the Jews were in Egypt. There were 10 plagues. We were rescued and given an exodus from Egypt. And the Bible is once again proven to be, well, it's not meant to be a history book, but it does contain a lot of history in it. And that history, I'm sure the more we find, the more we'll find that the history is accurate. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shmuel.
Do you have any parting words?
Just give it some time. If there's any parts of the Bible that you think are not accurate, just give it some time, and you'll see evidence will pop up for it. This stuff is happening every week. I know I come across, the amount of science now, the idea that, there's this idea that science disproved the Bible has been totally put on its head. Now it's the atheists that are arguing against the science rather than, rather than the theists. Thank you very much. And hope this will be value to some people. And
if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. And myself and with Dr. Becerra will do our best to respond and reply. And deal with any issues that you might arise. Okay, thank you very much. God bless. We'll speak to you next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.